Gone are the days where you can just head down, deliver for your shareholders, no one else asks questions. So many people have opinions on your business now. External regulators, public scrutiny, the media, your customers, general socio-political issues, right? Societal issues where CEOs are being asked to take a stand. The reality is, though, that employees and consumers are increasingly making their employment decisions or their purchasing decisions on, is this a company that I feel good about?
Welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leader Show. And today I have an incredible guest with me, someone that I follow because she writes about things that I love, but also much in line with my work. So it's Carolyn Dewar. So Carolyn is a senior partner in McKinsey company San Francisco office. Carolyn founded and leads McKinsey's CEO and board excellence practice, partnering with many Fortune 100 CEOs to maximize their effectiveness. And the reason why I invite her, actually, Carolyn, on the show, because she's also a co-author of New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author book, CEO Excellence, The 6 Mindset That Distinguish the Best Leaders from the Rest. And of course, she also works extensively with clients to drive transformational programs like merger, strategic shift, crisis, hypergrowth, and culture initiatives to drive change and performance. Carolyn is actually a Canadian and British citizen and living in San Francisco, as we said, and with her 2 children and husband. She's a board trustee as well of the Bay Area Discovery Museum and has a master's degree in economics and international relations from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Carolyn, welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Carolyn, I would like to start with a question about the context here, because we are facing such incredible challenging times, especially CEOs that need to lead organizations through all this uncertainty, increasing inflation, different business model, increase of cost and prices all over the place, challenging on supply chain. So what is your view about what's going on with the CEO right now in 2022?
Absolutely. The world needs great leaders right now, right? And needs great CEOs. There is so much going on. And I think that's part of why we wanted to dig in, is we were hearing more and more from leaders. How do I learn from others? What are others doing? Am I thinking about things right? A lot of people talk about the CEO role being lonely, and it is. And so we were trying to share some of the lessons learned across other great CEOs, because I do think we're in unprecedented times. I mean, that being said, there seems to be some truths that remain and some principles of good leadership that still are good leadership. And so what does that need to look like in our context?
Yeah, definitely. And I think right now, really great leaders, they need to show up. It's really the time to show up as a leader, because, when everything, it's easy and everything works and, the market is just flourish, right? It's honestly easier really to lead organization. I mean, it's never really easy, but definitely be easier than what they're facing right now. So I agree. It's really that. And the other thing that I pick from what you just said is there are a lot of misconceptions about being a CEO, right? But definitely the fact they are isolated or they feel isolated is definitely true. It's not just a misconception, but there are many others, especially from a leadership standpoint. And that's something I would like to discuss with you today, because you wrote a book that is for me super important for a couple of reasons. Why? Because one is definitely because you talk about CEOs, and that's my life, and that's what we're talking as well in the podcast. So perfect. And the other more, if you like, a little bit deeper reason of that is the fact that you mentioned the word mindset. And my work, as I think your work too, is really related to the mindset first, because mindset drives not only performance, but better behaviors or different behaviors that then they turn into potentially breakthrough performance. So it's really everything starts from mindset. But it's a little bit underrated, the importance of mindset when you lead an organization. So before stepping into all the 6 mindset that you find out in your research, would you like to tell us first why you decided to write this book, and second, maybe very quickly, how did you do it? Because I know you went through research, although that these are most of them are clients, but why you wanted to focus on mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important focus. And so, as you said, the book came about. There's a lot of books written about individual CEOs, right? Iconic household names. There's also books broadly about leadership. But we were hearing more and more from CEOs that they would love to learn from each other. What is this unique role? How do you do it well? Both for the CEOs themselves, for those who aspire to it, and those who work with senior leaders. And so we had the privilege of sitting down and interviewing one-on-one almost 70 of the world's best CEOs. And
Right.
we did take an analytic approach to who they were, right? You mentioned clients, they're actually not all clients. We took a broad brush and we said,
Okay.
of the couple of thousand CEOs who've led a Fortune 1000 company in the last 20 years, who has outperformed? So you had to be in the top quintile of performance relative to your industry peers. So
Mm,
within automotive or tech or oil and gas, or in insurance, you had to have outperformed. You had to have been in role for at least 6 years. And we wanted to talk to folks who had been around long enough that they had to eat their own cooking, right?
yes.
Decisions they made in the early days they were living with, and they'd been through some of the track record. And then there were reputational screens. So with that, we got it down, and we spent time with almost 70 of these CEOs saying, what do you do? And actually our question did start out with, what is it that you do? And it was them who prompted us to say, actually, it's not so much what I do, it's how I think. It's the mindset that I have as I
Interesting.
approach the job. Everyone has their own style, but there's if you adopt a mindset of a CEO, you'll find a way to kind of operationalize that day to day. So that's where we focused. How do we get inside their heads?
Love that. Actually, that's quite interesting. So, in other words, what I can understand from what you're saying is they essentially have decided to talk about their mindset rather than you specifically asking that question, which is quite interesting because that actually explains why mindset really is so critical for the CEO. It's not really much about the technical job or the challenge they're facing. It's really how to turn into a performance CEO starting from the mindset. Eh,
Absolutely. And in a world of change, it's even more important, right? You
of
can't
course.
anticipate everything that's going to happen, but if you know how you'll think about it and what are the principles you'll use to approach, you can kind of navigate anything.
Yeah, and that's great. The other thing I pick up from what you said is you spend a lot of time in curating essentially the pool of CEOs to interview based on a number of analytic data and approach, and I love that because I think that's a good way because when that's like kind of a confession here. So when we invite CEOs on the show, and we had a lot of great CEOs here, the question in the back of my mind is, are we inviting someone that is inspiring, is really successful? Because from the media, from the outside, it's really difficult sometimes to really understand what's really happening in the organization. So we need to choose based on gut feeling, based on what we know maybe from employees. But I'm glad that you went through a proper research, because I think otherwise the data, I'm not saying they're not validated, but they need to
Yeah.
make sense, right?
And you think now what 30% of CEOs don't make it past the first 3 years, right?
Exactly.
They're good folks, good leaders, but clearly they weren't nailing it. And so we wanted to make sure we focused on people who had really done well.
Yeah, because you can see what kind of an impact really they made along their tenure. Now that's probably, but that's not for this episode. But
Yeah.
that's interesting because we know that the average tenure of a CEO right now, it's short, it's getting shorter. So getting to 6 is not so easy nowadays, right?
No.
So it's interesting. You pick a number 6. Wonderful. All right. So why don't we dive into the book? And so essentially you collect a lot of interviews, and they came up with a number of information, facts, opinion, etc. So what really did come out from interviewing them, really?
There was really two lenses. The first question, which was more foundational, is what is the job anyway?
Mm,
And so there were these 6 elements of the CEO role. We tried to get it down. It just isn't less than 6, right? These are big jobs. Setting strategy, managing the organization, your team, your board, external stakeholders, and yourself. Those are kind of the 6 things that CEOs are spending time on. And then the bigger question was, within those, how do you do them well? What is the secret sauce? And that's where this notion of mindset came in. So there's sort of a mindset on each of them for how they approach that part of the job. But there's also one that kind of is an overarching piece, maybe before we get in, which is there's those 6 pieces, but as the CEO, you're also the integrator across those. And
mm,
there was a lot of discussion about being kind of the chief integration officer. Satya Nadella at Microsoft had a great quote when we were talking about loneliness. He said, one reason why it's lonely is an information asymmetry problem. No one else sees all 6 of those things. the way that you do. Your team doesn't, your board doesn't, your investors don't. And so you feel like the glue kind of keeping all those spinning plates or all those pieces together. And your job is to make sure that they're working well, their interdependencies, that it's all going to come together. So that's almost its own job, kind of sitting as a layer on top.
And I don't think you interviewed in your list. I don't remember. I don't think so. Lorenzo Simonellis, the CEO.
No.
Okay, so the CEO Becker Hughes that we actually had on the show a few weeks ago. And what you just said, that's actually is like he just said it to me, because
Right.
he said exactly one thing. That he said one of the major job of the CEO is connecting the dots, and putting together things that are, that you can see other people they can't see. So in this perspective, it sounds really aligned with what you just said, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And because of that, not being apologetic about creating time to do that thinking, right? You
Mm,
could easily go from meeting to meeting just trying to make sure everyone else is doing their job. But most of these CEOs had reached a point to say, I actually don't apologize that I also need time to do that connecting work and that thinking, looking ahead strategically, looking around corners, learning what's coming next. And so I know we're jumping ahead, but they built in time to do that thinking, to do that learning, because they realized if they didn't do it, no one would. That's work only they can do.
yeah. Otherwise, the typical risk of not doing that is jumping
Right.
into operational side of the business and get stuck into that, right?
And a firefighting.
Exactly right. Exactly right. No matter really how large is the organization, because sometimes people think, well, if it's a small business, it's clearly the CEO, has more tendency of jumping into operational side of the business. Actually, it's not. Even large organization can fall
Yeah.
into that trap if they're finding time to think more critically, strategic about where they want to go as an organization. Love that. So you identify the 6 mindset, right? So what are they? So shall we go maybe one by one, and then we'll see
Yeah,
where we get.
let's do it. The first one, which is on setting direction. So all things strategy, resource allocation, does the organization know where it's going? The
Mm.
mindset is be bold. Now, in a way that seems obvious. Of course, you need to be bold. It probably should actually be bold and be right, right? Because if you were bold and wrong, you wouldn't have made it to 6 years. But if you weren't bold at all, you never would get that outperformance you're looking for, right?
Totally.
And so what does that look like as a CEO? Two quick examples. Be bold in direction setting. Ajay Banga talked about reframing the game when he was at MasterCard,
Mm.
right? And so if we can rewind our minds back over a decade ago, when he took over, all the chatter in the hallways was about how do we beat Amex? How do we beat Visa? How do we gain market share in credit cards? And he, with his team, stepped back and said, wait a minute, that's a small game. That's not the
Mm.
game we're playing. We're trying to, at the time, credit cards were less than 10% of the world's transactions. We're trying to shape this. We want to help reframe all of transactions. And their phrase they came with was, we're going to kill cash, which is sort
Mm.
of an aggressive phrase, but it was a real reframe for the organization that he as a CEO could say, we're thinking small, we're thinking too narrow. The bigger game we could play is all of this. And from that, it gave permission to the organization to challenge assumptions about what they do and don't do, to try new things. They went into debit and online and went from 12 billion in market cap to over 300 billion in market cap. A
Wow.
massive shift in 10 years. But it was, as the CEO, you're the one who can give permission to the organization to think a little bigger. Right. One last one, Mary Barra, on being bold around resource allocation. Right. The average company tweaks its budget a couple of percent a year across business units and functions.
Mm.
She swung 50% of the R&D budget to electric vehicles at GM.
Wow.
I mean, a
Wow.
massive, massive shift. And it takes guts to do that, right? And it also meant she was taking money away from other things. She exited some countries like India. They'd been in for years and never made money. So she said no to some things and she reallocated that. That, again, is work really only the CEO can do, at least at the company level, to make those kind of swings happen. So that's what boldness looked like, right? Placing some bets, putting your money where your mouth is, and going for it.
And I love that, and that's my finding too. So for example, when I work with clients, we normally start with building a bold vision for the future. It's really thinking about possibilities for a better future that you don't see right now. In my experience, actually, many CEOs they're failing, or at least let's call the average CEOs with average performance, they don't really want to go there. They are concerned or worried about building
You
something
don't want
too
to
bold.
ruin what you have.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So they prefer um, either they want it or not want it. At the end of the day, what they normally tend to do is doing something that just produce incremental or predictable performance, and they're okay with that. But maybe complaining later, say, "Oh yeah, that's not big enough," right? But because they didn't start from having a bold vision for the future. Love that. Yeah, makes absolutely sense. Right. So you got me. So what's the next one?
Let's hit the next one. The next one is around the organization. So do you have the culture, the talent, the organization design that you need? And the mindset on this was these CEOs treated the soft stuff as if it was the hard stuff, right? In two ways. This, all things culture, talent was not something they deemed soft. It was not outsourced to HR. It was a business issue. And they treated it with the seriousness of it being a business or operational issue. You would never take an operational issue and say, oh, we'll do our best efforts. We'll see how it goes. We won't really measure it. Yet people do that with culture and talent all the time, right? Even diversity initiatives, sort of do the best you can. These CEOs knew exactly what shift they needed to make happen, whether it was a cultural shift, right? At Sony, it was a shift towards the wow factor, right? At Microsoft, you hear about growth mindset. They knew which shift they were trying to make. They could measure it. They held people accountable. They had real initiatives behind it. They asked their business leaders about it. And the same for talent, right? The mini mindset for talent was they didn't care about people. They cared about roles, right? And that seems a little bit counterintuitive. They don't care about people. But it was this notion that instead of starting with the list of usual, suspects, usual people that you rely on, your high potentials, they instead said, what is the list of roles that matter most, given where we're trying to go strategically, right? Is there a data capability? Is there a certain role? Maybe we're doing an Asia expansion and the country manager in the first country we go to is critical because they're going to set the tone. They knew what roles would disproportionately make or break their strategy. And then they made sure they had A players in those roles. It's a slightly different frame rather than starting with your list of high potential A players and saying,
And
where
then
do
you
we
find a
put them?
place for them, right?
Right. It's like, where are the 50 spots where we can't afford not to have amazing talent? Now let's look to see if we have it there. Quite a strategic, business oriented way to think about people.
It's really looking at the future, and it's very consistent with building, the bold vision for the future. So you know where you want to go, and you start thinking about who is the right person for the role, rather than just elevating people and then we'll try to find a place for them because they are potential, right? And you're right.
Absolutely.
I think it's it's nothing necessarily new, but very few organizations actually have that approach, thinking about the future. And by the way, I think it's super important right now as well for all this conversation about the skills of the future, right? What's going to happen 2030 and forward.
I love that broadening, right? It's not just individual people, but what are the skill pools that are critical for us and how will we build them?
Exactly. Many organizations are very narrow in their view. So what they say is what we need right now to solve the challenges that we're facing without looking and thinking about what's going to be the skill that we need in the future. And that's, I think, is pretty much in line with the approach that you just mentioned, thinking about, so let's design the future first, and then let's do, in other words, reverse engineering and see what people we need to put in their place. And of course, the cultural element then, of course, makes absolutely sense. Although, especially in the technology industry, we're still thinking that maybe some cultures they're not really designed for wonderful performance, right? So there is still
and I'm here in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of fast growth tech companies. And even the culture that you had to get you here, yes, it's wonderful. There's parts you want to preserve, but as you IPO and scale as a company, there's some other elements you probably need to weave in. And how do you be intentional about that? And you're not ruining what makes you special, but you're building it. Some people refer to it almost as adolescence, right? You go through these awkward teenage years. You need to start acting like an adult, but you don't want to become your parents, right? And so how do you keep that spirit, but also scale? There's some interesting analogies.
And I think many founders in particular, they are really scared about culture because they have concern of while they are growing and scaling, then the culture will be diluted. So the new entity will be so different than their own baby when they started, right? So
And
it's,
they have to find a way to scale it, right? They've gone
yeah,
from a sense where they could
exactly.
hear everyone and they essentially were the culture carrier to how you have to institutionalize that so that when you're not in the room, the culture still lives on. Right?
Totally, totally. And not, it doesn't rely only from the founder, right? And what he wants. Wonderful. So let's move to mindset number 3.
Yeah. Mindset number 3 is related. They all kind of build on each
Yes.
other, but this is specific to the team.
Mm,
And one of the big, even folks who'd had big jobs before, big P&Ls, big responsibilities, when you get to the CEO level or other equivalent levels, you just can't do it all yourself, right? And there was this recognition, and to be fair, all these guys and women had been in roles for at least 6 years, so they maybe didn't start this way,
mm,
that their only power and ability to get things done is through other people,
mm,
right? Especially in these large institutions. How do you get your leadership team working well together, operate with an operating model to run the place? And so, this idea of managing the psychology of the team, right? A lot of people focus on individual who are going to be my direct reports. I need to have a bunch of rock stars. And while that's great, most of these CEOs said they would prefer to have a team that was an all-star team rather than a bunch of individual incredible leaders. Now, hopefully you end up with a bit of both, but almost to the point where they'd rather have, A minus or B plus players that are operating effectively together rather than a bunch of individual big egos that are clashing at the top. And part of it comes back to that Satya quote about being a lonely role. One of the ways you can make it less lonely is if you're not the only one being that enterprise leader, and you can get your direct reports to also think like they're collectively running the organization rather than just their silos. And so when they walk into that meeting, are they representing marketing and legal and Asia and a certain product or engineering group? Or are they walking into that room as a joint leadership team for the company? That's the psychology these CEOs were aiming for, so that there was work that only that team could do that was different than just their silos. They knew how they were making collective decisions. They knew which decisions are collective versus their own day job. And at some point, they could run the company 70% of the time without the CEO being there, right? Because we'll
nice.
get to it in a minute. There's a lot of other stuff the CEO is doing other than the day to day. So you need that team to be operating effectively together, and it's a real investment in time.
It is, and I think it's the shift in our mindset, thinking about team not as a just set of values, but team such as a performance unit. So when you start thinking that way, that is a way out to really empowering teams and making sure they become high performance team. And I think that I pick from what you said, and I totally agree with you, is this idea of not relying on the prima donna. So the high achievers, performers, they are great maybe for the short-term results, but they're not helping to build the culture, the trust, and the element of teams as you just described it. Love that. And also I think that the level of autonomy, right? Because I think that's another more thing I think is important to say. Many teams, they don't have a level of autonomy, so they feel really under pressure, suffocating maybe with their team leaders, particularly CEOs. They're micromanaging, or they want to jump into operations, as we said before. But given the autonomy and flexibility to do their own things, to try to experiment and to get to solutions on themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is another broader topic, but when you were talking about autonomy, I know a lot of senior leaders are struggling with hybrid work and in the office, not in the office, all
Exactly.
those things. One of the unlocks there has to be that you're managing to outcomes, not process, right?
Yes.
If you're micromanaging in a way that if I can't see them outside my office and see that they're working and count fingers and toes, they can't be working. That says something about your management, right? Do you really know what the outcomes are, to your point, and giving them the autonomy to be able to get the work done and the results?
But also, if that happens, there is a deeper problem, right? In terms of trust and culture, as we discussed. So
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
piece needs to be in place in order to make sure then you can give autonomy to people. Otherwise, you're going to get exactly to the point. All right. So let's move to mindset number 4.
Yeah. So the first three are all ones that, frankly, most people in most big jobs have done, right? They've set strategy, organization, team. The next three are the ones that were the most surprising to newer CEOs.
Okay.
Right? So 68% of the CEOs we talked to said once they got in the job, it wasn't at all what they thought it would be. They're like, I've been an operator before, I can run a business. And then we get to board, external stakeholders, in your own time, right? So the board one, this is the one where I feel there was the biggest difference between the average advice or the average wisdom and these real outperformers. To your point of what do the great ones do? Because to be honest, look, the average mindset on dealing with your board is it's something to deal with, right? You get through the board meeting, you get to go back to running your business, right? They're fine, but it's more something to be tolerated. I mean, I'm being purposely provocative, but you hear a lot of that. These CEOs had gotten to a point, might not have started this way, where they really thought about their board differently. They said, how do I help the directors help the business? And if my goal really was to have the board be helpful to my business and to me, what would I do differently? And I was with the CEO yesterday, and she said, the board is the best free consulting advice in the world if you get it right, right? They're these incredible leaders. What would you do differently? First, you make sure that you have people on the board who have relevant skills and experience for what you need. You'd be surprised how many boards, you're doing a global expansion strategy and no one in the board has left your
Understand
town,
and think about that.
right?
Yeah.
Right. It's a bit of an issue. And so, again, you typically have to work with the board chair over time to evolve the board. But even if you don't, you can build their skills, right? So Piyush Gupta at DBS in Singapore brought his board on a tour of tech companies to show them what that looks like and educate them, right? So they need to have skills that are relevant. The second part is how you interact with them. If you really want them to be helpful, you're spending every day thinking about your business. They may be a couple of days a month, right? So what's the information they need so that they have the context, enough context to engage meaningfully and be helpful? It's not a 600-page board binder where you just bury them in data and say, there, I've given you everything, right? But are you being open and transparent about what they need to know? Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan spends the first hour of his board meeting, not the last, just him alone with the board, no paper, where he talks about here's what's keeping me up at night, here's what I'm worried about, here's what you need to know. You don't need to make a decision, but I'm letting you know so that if it happens later and I come back to you, you had context. A number of the CEOs, Hubert Joly at Best Buy, talked about the same, almost radical transparency. Tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly. Bring them on the journey. It also builds the trust so that when you need to come with a tough decision, they know you haven't been hiding anything. They know enough context, to be able to make the call. But all of these are pretty unusual. Not every CEO, certainly not brand new CEOs, have the confidence to do that. But when you do, it just sets such a better tone. So much more productive.
That's super interesting. So it's really shifting the idea of the board, like, okay, we need to just manage in the board and make sure the board is happy, and then I go back to business, essentially. But it's more about leveraging the board, understanding how you can get the most out of the board, but also be open to be transparent, in other words, really using the board as an advisory group, right?
Exactly.
That's what it's supposed to be.
It's a resource available to you.
Exactly.
As a group and individuals, a lot of the CEOs talked about how the board meeting is one thing, but the most valuable is they know who on the board to go to for which topics. Oh, I need a thought partner on our tech strategy. I've got someone for that. I call them.
Yes.
I need someone to help me develop one of my people, right? They're even engaging them in developing their bench. I'm going to have her coach and see how that works out. And so they're using them essentially as, advisors.
As a resource, right? And I think to your point, one-to-one, that's why, for example, I suggest CEOs to start having an influential, high-stake conversation with each member of the board and try to be a relation one-to-one basis, not just a group, because it doesn't work. So love that. And I think, but also you identify the challenge for first-time CEOs, right? So maybe they don't have the confidence to open up, for the first time with a board. It might look like more like an enemy rather than like a friend, right? So probably a little bit more challenging for first-time CEOs.
Yeah, and I work a lot with new CEOs, getting them off and running. And a number of them too will say, well, my predecessor didn't have that, right? He or she had a guarded relationship with the board. And in that way, a new CEO is an opportunity to reset. It's a bit of an unfreezing moment. And it is a chance to go in your first couple of board meetings and say, hey, I'd love to set a new tone. Let's
Yes.
talk about how we work together. Here's how I'd love to work with you. It means that if I bring you bad news, you can't freak out, right? There's a mutual understanding there. But sometimes being a new CEO is a moment to have that conversation.
Yeah. And actually, I agree to your point. Maybe setting the, as I call them, the rules of the game with the board. How we want to deal with each other. How we want to communicate. That's important. I think it's underrated. So love that.
Absolutely. And often not done, right? We
No,
just sort of assume.
exactly. But that's and then it start with the unsaid. I thought, and that you wanted this, and I thought something different. So that's honestly, it's a misleading and difficult for expectation. Love that. So number 5.
Yes. Number 5, external stakeholders. This one is changing a lot. And I'm sure you
Mm,
hear this from the CEOs you work with, right? Gone are the days where you can just head down, deliver for your shareholders, no one else asks questions, right? So many people have opinions on your business now. External regulators, public scrutiny, the media, your customers, ESG interest groups, your employees are obviously an internal stakeholder, but a key one. And CEOs are struggling with, who do I have to listen to? Who do I engage with and on which topics? Right? Certainly things as they relate within your 4 walls are easier, right? If people have opinions or expectations of how you operate, you need to address that, you talk about it. There's this kind of next concentric circle of issues that aren't in your 4 walls, but directly affect your business, right? Maybe it's trade policy, maybe it's supply chain issues, maybe it's other industry dynamics. CEOs feel relatively comfortable engaging on those and can see why. And then recently, there's this whole broader set of just general socio-political issues, right?
mm,
Societal issues where CEOs are being asked to take a stand and to take a stand on behalf of their business and sometimes them personally. And there's real question marks on, should they be doing that? Shouldn't they? How do we think about it? What issues should I take a stand on, even if they, quote, feel nothing to do with my business? What does that look like? The reality is, though, that employees and consumers are increasingly making their employment decisions or their purchasing decisions on, is this a company that I feel good about? So kind of whether you like it or not, we're getting dragged into these topics. And I think that companies who are navigating it well, no one's nailing it, right? But those who are coming back to a mindset of, I start with the why.
mm,
The why for our company, I have a really clear view of why we exist as a company, our purpose, essentially, what it is we're trying to do in the world, what do we stand for, both in terms of our business and what we're trying to do, as well as our values, how we're trying to operate. CEOs who have a clear sense of that use that as a litmus test for, okay, so is this issue out there something that directly is involved in our ability to be who we want to be in the world? Should we engage in that way? And they also understand the why of the other stakeholders. And so
mm.
I think about a CEO of a Finnish oil and gas company who had quite an ambitious ESG agenda, yet every time he drove into work in the morning, there were Greenpeace protesters in the parking lot. And he's like, okay, but we're doing all these good things. Eventually, one day, he invited them into the office and they ended up spending time together. And it went on for several months. And he really tried to understand their why. What were they trying to accomplish? He shared what their company was trying to accomplish. It turns out there was a lot of common ground. They actually
Mm,
were all trying to make a shift towards
exactly.
a more green solution, but they had just different ways of approaching it. And it became a really powerful collaboration and they learned a lot from each other.
Yeah, in other words, they were looking to the same problem from a different perspective. That's
A
really what
much
it's all
shorter,
about.
better way of saying it. Yes.
No, but you explain it properly. But that's what it is, really. It's
Yeah.
looking at the same thing and having a different perspective and start actually having bias and judgment about the other people's view about things. That normally what create conflict or contrast between people. I love that. And the other thing is confirming what your point about spending focus and priority to managing external stakeholders. The fact that many CEOs, they're looking inward. They try to see what's going on in the organizations. Everything that we do here is brilliant, it's fantastic. The market just loves us, etc. They don't have an outward. They don't look at externally. But with this critical thinking, starting with why, and I love that. I think it's really a game changer. I love exactly that. Wonderful. So let's go to the final one.
Final one. The final one kind of brings it all together. This is about your own personal operating model, how you spend your time, how you show up as a leader. And the mindset on this one was do only what you can do, right? Easier said than done. So how do you do this? And there's lessons for all of us in this one. A couple of things. One was, this notion of having a to-be list. So this was more about how you show up as a leader. Michael Fisher at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, he prints out his agenda for the day, his to-dos, his meetings that he has, and he writes next to each one, how do I need to be in each of those meetings? It's an interesting concept, and it's not about, he's still very authentic. He's still himself. He's not faking it. But he recognized that as the CEO, when he walks into a room, how he shows up and the energy he brings has a massive impact, whether he's intentional about it or not. Right? You walk down the hallway and you have a grumpy look on your face. Suddenly, your team is worried that you're having a bad quarter and the business is bad. Right? Like people interpret everything that you're doing. And he also recognized that throughout his day, he needs to code switch or compartmentalize some really different meetings. So he might be going from a really tough regulatory meeting to a town hall with 1,000 employees where he needs to be inspiring, to maybe sitting with a customer who's upset about something, to then making a tough strategic decision. Who does the organization need in its leader in each of those moments? Maybe in this one, I need to be decisive because the team's been spinning and we just need to make a call. In this other, and so this notion of being as thoughtful about who you're being in each interaction, not just what you're doing, was a big theme that came out, and I thought a fascinating one in terms of your role as a leader.
Yeah,
The second part is a little bit more tactical. It's more about how you spend your time, right? And you imagine these CEOs just have an unending amount of requests on their time, and how do you think about it? Most of them admitted in the first year they didn't get it right, and there was some point at around month 9 or month 12 where they woke up and they realized they couldn't continue at that pace. And this mindset of how do I manage it as a series of sprints, right? There's a lot of talk about, is it a marathon or a sprint? But it can't be a marathon because you can't wait till the end to have results. It's not just a sprint because you want to be around for a while, but you do need these moments where you can surge and be incredibly busy and focused. And then you need some ability to recover and then surge again. And that can be within your day, within your month, within your year. So they got very, very deliberate about managing their calendar so that they would have, sprints, but then something to recover. And their recovery is different for each person, right? Sometimes you need a break or a rest. Sometimes you go do some exercise. Sometimes you go and do something that gives you energy, right? Like what at work do you love doing? Maybe there's a team you love being with or a customer you love being with. So they were very deliberate about planning their time so that they could keep the energy up.
And that's actually aligned with the principle, especially from a neuroscience standpoint, of peak and valley. So you get to the peak and then that's your maximum performance. You get to the peak performance, but you also consume a lot of energy, and normally it can be so long for a number of reasons related to how our body essentially reacts and performs. So you need to have those valleys to relax, to re-energize yourself, to thinking more, etc. So really, I think they're going through that process.
And I think at an organizational level, that's happening too, right? So as the leader of you think everyone has done such a big push over the last few years with the pandemic, with everything going on in the world. It felt like we didn't even really get to catch our breath. And then there's Russia, Ukraine, recession, all these things. And I think that's why a lot of people are really concerned at the moment about burnout. We haven't had that chance to catch our breath, right? It's been one thing after another. And so you have to be really deliberate about creating those for your organization. Are there some small wins you can celebrate? Is there something you can do to be like, okay, this was a good day. Now let's take on the next challenge.
Yeah, very intentional of building these moments in the organization. And I think you're right. I think probably there was an expectation, I think was totally wrong, that working remotely could have actually helped people to spend more time relaxing, maybe at home, etc. And the reality actually got worse for a number of reasons.
People worked longer hours.
Exactly.
They didn't have the blend. Yeah, it all blended together.
Totally right. Just one small comment about the first point that you made about the number 6 is being essentially, as I say, the message. So, and I think many CEOs, they don't get this. Actually, many leaders, they don't understand that every single gesture, every single action, every single word they use, every single email they send is, observed, judged, and sometimes duplicated, whether they like it or not. If it's not consistent with the culture they want to build, that's when it's going to be a problem. So they need to remind themselves that.
I remember one of the CEOs we talked to was horrified to find after a few weeks in the job that some little comment they'd made on the first day had spun up an entire cottage industry of teams who were now working on that as a project. And he just thought it was a passing comment, right? And so with that comes amazing influence, but you have to be careful. Right.
Absolutely. A great example. Yeah. That's exactly the point. Wonderful. Yeah. So Carolyn, we went through the 6 mindset. I just love them. So to me, it really resonates a lot with my experience. So that's amazing. I was sure about that because I read it before. Now, if we want to give the final maybe advice to CEOs looking at the future. So now, we talk a little bit more about the current situation, which is challenging, the market, the uncertainties. You came up with amazing research about, what are the mindsets of successful CEOs and what they need to do in order to get to excellence. Now, what is maybe one piece of advice, maybe 2, that you would like to give to CEOs based on all we discussed so far?
Sure. I think there's a thread throughout a lot of what we've talked about, which is a appreciation and willingness to just always be learning. Right. So whether that comes from the boldness or your team, I think most people realize these jobs are too big for gone are the days of the person who knows everything, who just dictates it down. Right. The world is moving too fast. It's all too complex. The scale is too big. And so if you appreciate that you too are learning and your job is actually to help the team and the organization quickly learn, work it through, decide, move on, your ability to actually create that momentum is part of your role rather than you needing to have the answers, right? And that is quite a difference. A lot of the CEOs we talk to spend real time asking questions, learning, growing, having an external mindset, as well as working with their teams, right? And empowering their teams to make sure that they're bringing in new insights. And I think that's a slightly different leadership model or leadership skill set than maybe what we've had. And you have to be very comfortable with making decisions with incomplete information and then being willing to pivot and change as we go. I think those are all skills that really are coming into the fore. And there's a huge amount of listening in that, right? Listening to multiple stakeholders and again, being this integrator and then deciding where we're going to go.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think these are great advice. And I think every CEO actually should take them into account and start maybe making changes if they feel they're not really aligned with that. Because you mentioned listening. Honestly, not many CEOs are there listening, either the market, the stakeholders, the employees. So listening, we all say the importance of listening, but the reality is how many leaders consistently listen, to the stakeholders. Is one of the things that we take it for granted, but they're not in the organization. So,
and do they have the mechanism to do it? It's easy to get locked in an ivory tower and only have people around you telling you what you want to hear, and that's not going to work.
Yeah, the famous yes man, right? They're gonna just say what you want. So that's easy, right? That's not really what they want. And I love the fact that you mentioned about learning. There's continuous learning and try always to get to the next thing about their personal growth. I think in my personal experience, successful CEOs are those that believe in personal growth and they don't stop learning. They don't just stop learning. They keep going. Wonderful. That was an amazing conversation, Carolyn. I love that. So where people should go to get in touch more about you, your work, and of course, we'll put the book link on the show notes so people can have immediate access to the book. But tell us more about reaching you if they want to.
Sure. And we can put it out there. So Carolyn Dewar at McKinsey kind of gets you there. And whether it's the book or just, I think, as we said, the world needs great CEOs. And I think helping the CEO really envision where they're taking the company, what does that look like? And how will they do it well? That's what gets me really excited and out of bed in the morning. And so happy to talk.
Yeah, and I probably would like to finish with this. I think being a CEO is incredible responsibility, and So I get it. It's not easy at all, but I always say it's an incredible opportunity to change lives, right? To make an impact. And if we keep focusing on thinking, it's so difficult for the CEO, it's so challenging, it's so much pressure, etc. It's true, but on the other hand, it's an amazing opportunity. Many people would like to be in the CEO shoes, right? Just because they can make an impact, not just for the
I think that's such a great
pay.
reminder. And that, some of these companies now are bigger than the GDP of some small countries,
Exactly.
right? As you say, the impact you have, whether intentional or not. And so, yeah, how will you use that for good?
Totally right. Amazing, Carolyn. I so enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Wonderful to talk to you. The sun is fully up now, ready to start my day.